Hello, I've decided to make a little experiment and trying to make a video summary of the excellent article of Dr. Philip Hickey on this conclusive proof ADHD is overdiagnosed. The theme that certain so-called mental illnesses are overdiagnosed is becoming a little bit more popular now. Some psychiatrists seem to be very moderate and anti-psychiatry friendly, you might say, by stating this. And this is, in a way, the point of Dr. Francis's article. And it has an assumption that there is a correct level of diagnosis that can be found. So Dr. Francis has three statements in the opening. He says there are three possible explanations for the skyrocketing of ADHD. One, that diagnostic enthusiasts celebrate the jump as indication of increased awareness of ADHD and better case finding. Two, the diagnostic alarmists worry that we're making our kids sicker via environmental toxins, computers, overstimulating world, maternal drug use, etc., or some combination of the above. And then we have the diagnostic skeptics that attribute the change to raters, not the rated. It's not the kids that are sicker, it's the raters that are making the diagnosis too loosely. Dr. Pies then points out that in the DSM-3, the prevalence was listed as approximately 3%. DSM-4 cited it as 3% to 5%. That is when the DSM-4 was made, it was printed. But then from 1994 to the present day, a period where it's almost Francis's definition of ADHD that has counted, it has skyrocketed up to 15%. So the rate exploded when Francis put the definition of ADHD. Could it be that the relaxation of the criteria has made it easier to give a person the label? Then Dr. Francis goes on to talk about diagnostic reliability, where he says there is no gold standard or biological test to prove precisely which view is correct and what would be the ideal rate of ADHD to best balance the risks and benefits of being diagnosed. I am strongly in the skeptic school. Long experience has taught me how great is the impact on diagnostic rates of even small changes in how any disorder is defined or appraised. And this is greatly amplified when heavy drug company disease mongering aggressively sells the disorder to doctors, parents, and teachers. So Dr. Pies think it's Dr. Pies. Dr. Hickey says that's an interesting admission from Dr. Francis that there is no gold standard or biological test to prove precisely which view is correct. In other words, it's not possible to say who has ADHD and who hasn't, which should in principle be the point of making successive revisions of the DSM. Actually, this was the claim of Dr. Spitzer that we now have increased the reliability of the DSM. And here we have Dr. Francis telling us that this reliability doesn't really exist. So Dr. Hickey says it's gratifying that the guy who actually made the DSM-4, or was the head of the DSM-4, now admits that there is no diagnostic reliability, that it is basically just a collection of vaguely defined concepts. So Dr. Francis says that it's the raters that are too relaxed when they give the diagnosis. That is the problem. And then he says that from his experience, he knows that just a small change in the way the diagnosis is presented can lead to big changes in who are diagnosed, when it was actually he himself who made quite a lot of changes in the diagnosis, and the rates jumped. It is a mathematical fact that if the criteria are changed, then suddenly a lot more children will satisfy them and get the diagnosis. It's a mathematical fact, and that's what Francis did himself. Then Francis gets on to complain about the pharmaceutical companies and saying that they are the ones who initiated this epidemic. But Dr. Hickey points out that you cannot sell a sickness that hasn't been invented yet. And Francis contributed to reinventing ADHD so that it became a disease, became a problem for many more children that could be diagnosed now. And Dr. Francis points out that this might be Dr. Francis's ingratitude to the hands that fed him, since he developed the therapeutic guidelines for Johnson & Johnson's Risperdal and made a handsome sum of money on this. Then Dr. Francis refers to a few studies that have seen that if children are immature, in a way they are born late in the school year, they are more likely to have got a label of ADHD, in a way that ADHD is in a way immaturity. Dr. Hickey comments that this is of course an interesting observation, but how can that explain that suddenly there has been a 300% increase from 5 to 15% in the diagnosis? How can that be just immaturity that has been there all the time? So let's then see how this is in the DSM itself. In a way, are there any exclusions because of age and immaturity? DSM-3 that says that approximately half of the cases, the onset of the disorder is before age 4. So immaturity doesn't seem to be a problem there. So then there's a quote from the DSM-4 where it is recommended that you could diagnose these children down to the age of 2 or 3 if they wiggle too much when you try to read to them and things like that, although they caution that it's a little bit difficult to determine the diagnosis so early, but absolutely not a problem. 2 to 3-year-olds could be diagnosed. So psychiatry had already defined this kind of immaturity as a minimal brain dysfunction, and ADHD took over and really continued the medicalization of this, saying that it's a brain disorder, even if there's absolutely no sign that can show that it's a brain disorder. Basically, the list of symptoms in the DSM are lists of immaturity. Children who can't wait in turn, who wiggle in their chairs when they have to sit still, etc. Immaturity, basic definition of immaturity. In addition, all the ADHD symptoms are extremely vague. Often is a word that's often mentioned. And Dr. Hickey says that Dr. Francis should have known that the change of the criteria would invite doctors to medicalize just normal immaturity, since he had been a member of both the DSM-2 and the DSM-3 task force and seen how the effects of diagnosis wording could influence doctors into diagnosing more kids.